Sign it. You're the idiot here. My father shoved a Mont Blanc pen into my palm under the chandelier of the Drake Hotel, Chicago, while 180 people froze mid-toast. His voice carried through the microphone, soaked in champagne laughter. My sister Brooke beamed in her white dress, her hand resting on the golden folder that held the deed. The giant LED screen behind her glowed with looping renderings of a River North penthouse glass walls. Lake views, $18 million of pride. I stood at the edge of the ballroom, clutching the paper that said, "Waiver of rights and no contest." My mother's voice cut through the applause. "Don't make that face, sweetheart. Not everyone's meant to be brilliant. Your sister built a career. You draw feelings." Laughter again. I wanted to disappear. He leaned in closer, whispering just loud enough for the front tables to hear. "Sign get your 10,000 and be grateful you're in the photo." Every eye in the room turned toward me. My name on the banner looked like a joke. Brooke raised her glass. "To family legacy." I thought of the studio back in Evanston where I taught kids to paint through trauma, and the bills stacked under my coffee maker. I thought of my grandfather's sketches, the ones he said would one day hang in my place, not theirs. But those were gone. My father said they were in storage. I knew they weren't. I took the pen. The ballroom waited. The cellist stopped mid-bow, and then my phone buzzed. One missed call. Retired Judge Alan Pierce. The preview line scrolled across the screen in black letters, "Deed transfer not recorded yet. Forged POA. Call me now." My hand froze. For a moment, the air seemed to shift, the chandelier light flickering off the gold foil on Brooke's award. I slipped the phone beneath the tablecloth, hit replay, and listened to his voicemail transcribe itself, word by word. Forged POA, my signature, my name, not recorded yet. The world steadied. My heart didn't. Heart. My mother tapped the mic again. "She's dramatic. She'll sign. Idiots always sign when you dangle money." I smiled then for the first time that night. Not wide, not fake, just a thin, sharp curve. I put the pen down. "If one missed call can flip this whole room," I said quietly, "then maybe I should let it ring a little longer." The silence after that was clean, electric. A few phones tilted up to record. My father's hand twitched. My sister's smile cracked. Somewhere between the chandeliers and the screen showing that perfect penthouse, I realized something simple and devastating. They didn't just steal from me. They underestimated me, and underestimation is the first crack in every empire. When the applause at the Drake finally faded that night, I walked out into the cold air of Michigan Avenue and kept walking until the sound of traffic swallowed the echo of my father's voice. Back at my small studio in Evanston, the smell of acrylic paint and lemon cleaner grounded me again, the one space in the world where I was not the idiot of someone else's story. My students were children from the hospital, some with speech delays, some with burns that made them avoid mirrors, all of them honest in ways adults forget how to be. I had left architecture years ago because drawings of perfect buildings meant nothing when real people were breaking. I rented this corner space with money saved from weekend commissions and ran workshops for $10 a head. To my family, that meant failure. To me, it meant breathing. My parents, Thomas and Linda Monroe, lived in Winnetka, the kind of suburb where last names are brands and money has its own accent. They built their empire on real estate and reputation, and my older sister Brooke learned early how to play that game. She studied finance, married into it, and measured success by how loudly others clapped. I stopped attending most family dinners after the comments turned into scripts. In our group chat called Monroe Moments, they posted Brooke's magazine feature one week and a photo of my students' messy paint hands the next with the caption, "Tessa's kind of architecture." I left the group once. They added me back with a winking emoji. My grandfather, Edward Langley, a quiet professor from IIT, had been the only one who looked at my sketches and saw more than wasted potential. Before he died in 2019, he told me that creation was a form of service and that money was only good if it built something that lasted beyond applause. In his will, he left the family company Langley Holdings LLC and his original painting collection valued at about $2.5 million under a trust that would reward genuine service work. After his funeral, the family spoke about estate logistics like ordering dinner. Linda said the paintings would be stored for preservation. I never saw them again. They said the warehouse receipt was somewhere in Thomas's office, probably under tax files. Each time I asked, he smiled, like I was misplacing my mind. My life moved in quiet circles, train rides to the studio lists of expenses, on sticky notes, receipts for brushes, and snacks for the kids. The parents of my students sometimes asked why I kept doing this when grants were scarce. I said because someone had to. The truth was simpler because it was the only part of me that hadn't been laughed out of existence. One night in February, Brooke sent a group message of her standing beside a new BMW captioned promotion gift. Linda replied with hearts. Thomas wrote, "Some people produce some just paint." I took a screenshot of that thread, printed it on A3 paper, and hung it near the window above a caption that read, "When adults speak, children watch." The parents who visited smiled at it first, then nodded quietly. Some took photos. I didn't tell them it was my family's voice. It felt better that way, like turning poison into pigment. Weeks passed, and the weight of the missing paintings settled deeper. I visited the family home under the excuse of delivering old books to my mother, while she poured wine and Brooke bragged about a developer she was courting. I slipped downstairs to the storage room. The wooden crate that once held my grandfather's canvases was gone, replaced by boxes labeled seasonal decor. The catalog numbers were missing. When I asked Linda later, she waved her hand. "Storage company misplaced the form, darling. Everything's safe." I checked the receipt she handed me, printed in fading ink. The company address didn't exist. That night, I sat on the studio floor surrounded by the children's drawings drying on racks and stared at the city lights bleeding through frosted glass. Every joke, every message, every missing object began to connect like a map of quiet theft. They had turned me into the family's harmless artist, so I would never think to look too closely. The next morning, I emailed the supposed storage company. The message bounced back, domain not found. I took another screenshot. A small one, just for later. The night of Brooke's celebration replayed in my head like a bad theater loop, polished loud and cruelly rehearsed. The ballroom at the Drake was drenched in white light strings from a live quartet lacing the air with practiced joy, and the LED wall pulsing with slow pans of Brooke's smiling face framed by gold text that read, "Excellence and Legacy." My father stood center stage with the posture of a man used to ownership, a microphone in one hand and a tumbler of scotch in the other, his grin stretched wide for the audience of developers, bankers, and old neighbors who had come to toast the golden child of Winnetka. I was seated near the back between an empty chair and a woman from the firm who kept whispering admiration about Brooke's discipline. My mother, draped in navy silk, watched the stage with eyes shining from pride and gin. When the speeches began, they called my name as a token gesture, not affection the way one might read a forgotten name on a plaque. Our creative one, Linda said, letting the laughter fill the room like perfume. I smiled the way a person does when smiling is the only armor left. Then Thomas raised his glass higher and leaned into the microphone. "Every family has balance," he said, letting the pause stretch until it became anticipation. "One who builds, one who dreams, one who pays, one who paints. Brooke built our legacy. Tessa, well, she has always been the idiot." The word hit like a light slap, the polite kind delivered in front of guests, the kind that burns more because of the room's silence afterward. A few polite laughs rippled. Someone coughed, and I felt the temperature drop, even though the chandeliers blazed. My throat tightened, but I kept my eyes steady on the glass in my hand. Brooke's fiancé, Gavin, smirked at the table beside me, whispering something that made her laugh, and then the presentation resumed. The screen shifted to architectural renderings of a penthouse in River North drone footage, sweeping across floor-to-ceiling glass narration, booming about continuing the Langley legacy. Thomas spoke again, proud and deliberate. $18 million, he said. 80% ownership of Langley Holdings transferred to Brooke via her power of attorney executed on behalf of her sister Tessa, who graciously signed. I heard the last phrase echo before meaning, settled like ash. The audience clapped. Cameras flashed. My signature had become their prop. My mother turned toward me with a patronizing tilt of her head. "Don't look shocked, darling. Your grandfather would have wanted the company in capable hands." She said capable, the way some people say clean. My pulse roared in my ears. I wanted to shout, but the training of a lifetime held me still. When Thomas called me up to bless the moment I stood, because not standing would have looked worse. The stage felt slick beneath my shoes. He handed me a folder stamped waiver of rights and smiled for the cameras. "Just sign here," he said softly, "so no one has to waste time later." The pen was the same Mont Blanc from earlier, still heavy, still reeking of command. I stared at the lines of legal text. Somewhere in the front row, a guest whispered, "Poor thing." My phone vibrated again in my clutch, the silent tremor slicing through the noise. I lifted my head, slowly exhaled, and spoke in a voice calm enough to sound foreign. "May I take a picture of this before I sign just for my records?" The question hung there sweet and venomous. My father's smile wavered. "Of course, if it makes you feel official." Flashlights flickered as guests turned curious. I stepped slightly aside, angled the folder, and snapped 2 photos. The waiver, the page showing power of attorney Brooke's name, signed neatly, my own printed underneath. Receipts. The room clapped again, mistaking documentation for obedience. I returned to my seat, the phone warm in my hand. My mother whispered, "Don't make a scene, Tessa." I smiled. "I'm not." Behind me, the quartet began a soft reprise, something classical and empty. On the screen, a rendering of Brooke's penthouse rotated in perfect 3D, while my father announced that the deed would be finalized tomorrow morning at the recorder's office. Applause swelled. Glasses clinked, and for a moment I thought of my grandfather standing at his drafting table, measuring proportions with quiet patience, believing that truth-like architecture was built from what you could prove. My phone screen blinked with the missed call again. Later that night, when the guests drifted toward valet and my family posed for photographs under the lobby chandelier, I replayed Judge Pierce's voicemail in the bathroom stall, the words crisp, the tone urgent. "Deed transfer not recorded yet. Forged power of attorney. Call me now." I stared at my reflection, the smudged lipstick, the glittering room behind me, and the faint tremor in my fingers. Forged. My name forged. I saved the message, backed it up, sent it to my email, then deleted the notification from the lock screen before stepping back into the party. When I walked past my father, he was laughing with a client, boasting that tomorrow was a family milestone. I looked at him and felt something shift deep inside, not rage, not shock, just a cold, deliberate calm. He had built a house of glass and handed me the first stone. Morning light hit the stone steps of the Cook County Law Library like a summons, and I climbed them with my phone in one hand and the folder of receipts in the other. Inside the reading room, retired, Judge Alan Pierce waited with 2 binders already open. His tie loosened his eyes, clear in that way some people have. When they live by paper and memory, he greeted me with a measured nod and asked to see the photographs I had taken on stage. I slid my phone across, and he studied each image as if reading a confession. Then he tapped the page labeled Power of Attorney and said that date is from 2019, and your signature style does not match your known samples. He pulled a thin file from his binder and revealed a copy of an employment form I had signed in 2019 for the hospital art program. He lined them side by side and pointed at the angle of my S and the curve of my M. Here, your hand makes patient loops. Here the POA shows hard hooks, different pressure, different flow. He spoke quietly, almost kind, and then he laid out the path in clean sentences. The POA was fabricated after your grandfather's death. Preparations began the transfer of controlling interest in Langley. Holdings to Brooke is unlawful without your verified consent. The deed to the River North penthouse is not recorded, and any attempt to record it now will be flagged if we file notice before noon. My breath steadied for the first time in a day, and he kept going. The bigger wound is not the deed. It is the company, because someone used the painting collection as collateral for a corporate line of credit about $1.2 million. He slid a printout across the table. Northern Trust Collateral Schedule. Langley Originals pledged. I stared at the list of titles and felt heat climb my neck. I remembered the crate that had vanished the fake storage address, the jokes about preservation. He watched me recover and then explained how we would sequence the moves. File an emergency notice to the recorder, blocking any deed activity. Prepare a petition in probate to invalidate the POA and any derivative transfers. Send a preservation letter to the bank instructing them to freeze actions against the paintings until ownership is adjudicated. He said all of this while turning pages with fingers that did not shake. He had done this dance before for other people whose families believed paper could erase blood. My phone vibrated on the table. The family group chat lit up with fresh confetti emojis and one line from Linda that read, "Our Brooke dazzled the city last night," and another from Thomas that read, "Tessa, do not complicate grown-up matters. You never understood documents anyway." And then a third from Brooke with a photo of her holding up a key fob and the caption, "Tomorrow we record and toast, legacy." I read them all and felt the old ache, that mix of shame and anger. And then I felt something else, a thin thread of humor tugging at the corner of my mouth. Judge Pierce raised an eyebrow as if to ask whether I wanted a break, and I shook my head and said, "I need a printer." He gestured to the public workstation, and I sat down and typed an invoice to Thomas for $1,800. I wrote line item, humiliation fee, 3 hours at $10 a minute, billed for public defamation and coercion at the Drake. And I added a single sentence at the bottom that read, "Dignity over money is my creed, yet reimbursement is still due." I emailed it with a calm subject line and blind copied myself. A minute later, the chat pinged. Thomas replied with a laughing face and wrote adorable. And then a second later, he wrote, "You will regret this childishness when we finalize tomorrow." I closed the window and returned to the table. Judge Pierce did not smile, but I caught the flicker in his eyes, a recognition that small revenge can steady a spine. He flipped to another tab in his binder and lowered his voice. "There is something else you need to hear now because it will surface, and it is better if it comes from a person who respects you." He produced an old policy statement and a change form and placed them so that the dates aligned like teeth. He said your grandfather carried a life insurance policy of $2 million for years. The beneficiary designation named you with a service contingency. 3 months before he died, a new designation was filed, naming Brooke as sole beneficiary. The change was processed through a broker who works with your father. The signature on the form bears your grandfather's name, yet the handwriting is not consistent with his medical chart notes from the same month he looked at me and waited. The room seemed to tilt the carpet pattern, swimming for a second. The idea of that patient man, the one who taught me proportions and kindness, being rewritten on paper by people who loved money more than truth, it landed like a quiet stone in my chest. I asked whether it could be reversed, and he said it can be challenged. The insurer will require evidence. We will request recordings of the broker calls. We will subpoena emails. We will cross-check. Hospital logs for his functional status. He paused and added that courts look dimly on beneficiary changes made in the shadow of death, when the change benefits those in a position of influence. I exhaled and pressed my fingertips against the edge of the table until the room steadied again. The clock on the wall slid toward 10. We needed to file before noon. He asked whether I had any other evidence, and I showed him the bounced email from the fake storage company, the missing catalog numbers, the photographs of the waiver pages with metadata. He nodded and made copies. He had me sign a simple affidavit swearing to the authenticity of the photos and the events of last night. Then he called Victor Ung, a forensic accountant he trusted, and put him on speaker so we could all speak together. Victor's voice was quick, and even he had already begun pulling bank activity tied to the company and reading off wires. He said, "A transfer of $380,000 left Langley Holdings the previous week to an account that maps to a boutique furniture vendor favored by Linda. He said it smelled like self-dealing and a bridge to dress the penthouse before recording. I felt the word furniture like an insult. It is one thing to steal a legacy and another to buy chairs with its blood. We set tasks Victor to draft a preliminary analysis, Pierce to file the recorder notice and prepare the TRO paperwork, me to gather clean scans of every receipt I had ever saved that proved how I used my earnings for the kids when grants fell through. The idea was simple. Turn their narrative on its head by proving service, not status while we worked. My phone buzzed again. This time, a private message from Brooke that read, "Stop playing lawyer, you cannot even read a contract." I typed nothing back. I saved the message, I printed it, and slipped it into a blue folder labeled Voices. When noon neared, we walked to the clerk's office together. The corridor smelled like toner and old dust. Pierce filed the notice while I stood beside him and watched the stamp. Kiss paper, a physical sound like a door locking. Outside the sky was a plain white sheet over the loop, and traffic hissed. He turned to me and said, "Call me the moment anyone reaches out." Then he added, "One more thing. Do not confront them yet. Let the paper move first." That advice fit me like a well-cut jacket. I nodded and returned to Evanston, where the studio lights hummed and a child's painting of a purple house waited on the drying rack. I stood there and felt the sting of a dozen paper cuts, small, sharp, cumulative, each one a reminder that you can bleed a long time before anyone notices. Then I looked at the binder in my bag and understood that cuts can teach precision, and precision wins against noise, and I began to plan the next call. At the Peninsula Chicago the next afternoon, the marble lobby gleamed like a stage, polished for arrogance, and I walked through it holding a leather folder and a smile that could pass for surrender, my heels clicking softer than the sound of my pulse. The private conference room they reserved overlooked Michigan Avenue, a skyline my family treated like their private resume. Thomas sat at the head of the table, already unbuttoned. Linda poured mineral water into crystal glasses. Brooke adjusted her white blazer as if the color itself declared authority. I took the seat near the end where light from the window traced the rim of my phone. One-party consent, Illinois the recorder already running in my bag, my voice measured as I said I wanted to finish everything quickly, that I was ready to sign. Thomas looked pleased. Brooke exchanged a grin with Linda and said, "See, I told you she would come around. I asked them to explain the details so I could feel comfortable," and Thomas leaned back. Arrogance pouring like cologne, his words low and careless. He said the insurance, the shares, all of it had been streamlined, that once the beneficiary change was done, the rest was automatic. My stomach turned, but my face stayed blank. Linda laughed with that sharp practice sound that could slice through glass and said, "Sweetheart, you really think you are smart enough to read those contracts?" Her eyes gleamed. Brooke added with a smile that was both pity and triumph, "Tomorrow it will all be finished once the deed records. Then we can move on as a family." The air thickened. I asked softly if they would show me where to sign so that I could do it right. This time, Thomas passed me the new packet, still warm from the copier. I uncapped the pen. I brought different ink viscosity forensic variation and asked if they could demonstrate how to initial each page. Linda rolled her eyes but obliged, marking her initials. First her diamond ring, catching the light. Brooke scribbled hers next. I copied the motion but pressed lightly so the strokes looked tentative, submissive, harmless. Then I asked if I could try again on a scratch sheet to be sure I did it right. I used my pen this time, leaving ink that would fluoresce differently under lab light, a quiet trap set in plain sight. Thomas chuckled and said, "Perfectionism never suits the untalented." I smiled back, my voice soft, as I said, "Maybe talent just needs time behind them." The skyline glowed like an audience waiting for its cue. They talked about renovations. Linda mentioned ordering Italian furniture for the penthouse, and Brooke bragged about her upcoming interview with a design magazine. I pretended to take notes, but watched the time my phone vibrated once a silent text from Victor saying, "Ready when you are." I turned to Thomas and asked what he meant by streamlined earlier. He hesitated just long enough, then said, offhandedly, that once the beneficiary change went through last quarter, the policy was aligned with the estate plan, a slip so casual he did not hear himself. I leaned forward as if impressed. Linda changed the subject. Brooke tapped her nails against the table. I gathered the papers, thanked them for their patience, and excused myself under the pretext of needing to check one last form with the bank. Outside the room, the air felt thin. I walked directly to the coffee bar across the hall, ordered espresso, and called Victor. His voice came through steady and alert. He said he had pulled internal banking records for Langley Holdings and found a wire for $380,000 sent the previous week from the company account to a personal account in Linda's name. The memo read, Interior Imports. Milan, he said it looked like self-dealing. He said it would be easy to trace my hand. Tightened around the cup, the heat grounding me. I asked him to preserve every document he already had. He said he was sending encrypted copies to Pierce's office. He asked if they said anything incriminating. And I repeated Thomas's words about the beneficiary change. There was a pause. Then Victor said, "That is a confession if recorded," and I told him it was the relief that followed was not joy. It was something sharper, purpose shaped into calm. I returned to the meeting room where the three of them were still chatting. Brooke scrolling through her phone, showing Linda fabric samples, Thomas on a call bragging about tomorrow's recording. I collected the last of my documents and smiled politely. Brooke said, "Remember to dress nice tomorrow for the photo." I said, of course, walked out and pressed the elevator button. The mirrored doors reflected my face back at me, not furious, not broken, just focused below the surface of that calm. A plan had started to breathe. Every insult they threw was another signature they did not realize they had left behind on the ride down. I checked the audio file. 1 hour and 6 minutes of confession, laughter, arrogance, and self-exposure. I labeled it The Bait, sent a copy to Pierce and another to myself. When I stepped onto the street, the afternoon sun turned the glass towers into mirrors, and the city hummed with the indifference of something too big to care about small betrayals. But I cared. I cared enough to make sure each sentence they spoke would one day echo back in courtrooms where silence carried weight. That night, I returned to the studio, replayed the recording once more, listening to the sound of my mother laughing at my intelligence. The word idiot now transformed into evidence, every syllable a step closer to justice. I uploaded the file to a secure drive, labeled the folder May 27th meeting, and placed the pen I had used into a plastic sleeve, a small piece of plastic, holding proof that arrogance leaves fingerprints. I slept with the lights still on, not afraid, but alert, the kind of rest that comes when you know a storm is finally forming on your side of the sky. By morning, the city felt like a filed affidavit rather than a skyline line straight and edges sharp, and I moved through it with a checklist instead of nerves, first to Northern Trust where Judge Pierce had arranged a supervised review. The vault corridor swallowed sound as if secrecy were a temperature you could feel on your skin. The attendant logged our entry with deliberate strokes and a monitor in a side room, opened a window into the past. There was my father in a neat suit, signing the ledger. There was the box sliding out on rails. There was the angle of his shoulder as he blocked the camera with a folder, while a second hand reached in, and when Pierce asked for the zoom, we watched page corners flash and then disappear, the audit log paired with the footage like twin lines on a map, date matched date box, matched box, and the chain of custody report printed with an even hum that sounded like proof learning to speak. I held the paper and felt steadier, Next, we confirmed the collateral file. The bank maintained the painting collection listed by title and dimensions, with a valuation table that looked like a bruised $2.5 million pressed into a single column, a signature block carrying my father's flourish, and a witness line signed by an assistant who would later insist she never saw me authorize anything we requested. The full copy, the clerk made it without small talk, and when the last page cooled on the glass, we stepped back into the bright lobby where ordinary people signed ordinary forms and never imagined their families would one day try to turn love into leverage. I met Victor at a corner table across the street. He wore the careful calm of someone who invoices the truth for a living. He opened a laptop and tilted it away from the window glare. Inside a neat folder sat the audio file from the Peninsula, the bank schedule for the paintings, the vault video certification, the wire log he had pulled after hours, and the insurance change packets he had requested from the carrier through a contact who owed him a favor. We played the Peninsula recording again, not for cruelty, but for clarity. Thomas saying, the phrase, once the beneficiary change was done, it was automatic. Linda laughing at my ability to read Brooke, promising that tomorrow would finish me. The words slid across my skin without heat. Now they were measurements, not wounds. Victor exported a clean transcript and flagged the lines where admissions lived. We saved duplicates to cloud drives and labeled each file with date and hour and source so that any stranger could follow the path without guessing. Then we pulled the bank statement for the company account, and there it was a wire of $380,000 to an account in Linda's name with a memo that read Interior Imports. Milan Victor nodded. Once said, self-dealing is not a color. You can paint over, and cued the document for the packet we would deliver to the court. Pierce arrived with a folder marked Notice Ready, and we laid the pieces in order. First, the vault video certification. Second, the collateral agreement tying the paintings to the loan. Third, the audio file with a short affidavit explaining the recording rule that allowed it. Fourth, the wire log tracing company, funds out to a personal purchase. Fifth, the insurance carrier file that showed a beneficiary change at the shadowed edge of a life and a cover page that summarized the story without adjectives. When I read it end to end, I felt a clean line rise through me. Not triumph, simply alignment by noon. The recorder's office had stamped our notice, and the deed could not glide into place like a knife. And with that gate shut, we turned to the future. Stage public exposure would need more than outrage. It would need receipts arranged like instruments before a downbeat. So I went back to the studio and printed a single poster to hang in the window, Wanted People Who Build Souls. Volunteers for art sessions training provided the line was a soft joke aimed at the family motto of excellence. But it was also logistics. I would need hands when the children came after school, and I would rather the city see the kind of excellence that cannot be worn. Parents stopped at the glass and photographed the sign a nurse from the hospital messaged to ask how she could help a retired teacher, offered 2 afternoons a week. I said yes to everyone and filed their names away like lanterns. Late afternoon. Victor sent a new email with a subject that made my jaw harden. He had recovered a thread from Brooke's fiancé Gavin to the firm Rhodes and Hale messages drafted late at night that asked for a non-disparagement agreement to silence me after the deed recorded language that proposed penalties if I spoke about documents or family conduct, phrases that dressed coercion as discretion, and a final note that proposed serving the papers at my studio to make sure I understood the stakes. I read every line twice, then forwarded the thread to Pierce. He wrote back in, under a minute, "Keep breathing paper. Beats theater. We will include it." I printed the emails and added them to the blue folder where I kept the worst things they said. I titled that section, Voices They Meant to Hide at Dusk. The studio filled with the smell of tempera and soap and a chorus of small questions. Could I paint a storm? Could I paint the sound of my dog? Could I mix a color that felt like being brave? I moved among them and thought about money as a tool and dignity as the work, and the thought steadied my hands. when my phone vibrated with a new message from Linda that read, "We will send an agreement, tomorrow sign it, and be done." I did not answer. I cleaned brushes and wiped tables and took a photo of a purple horizon a child had made with a sponge. The image looked like healing. Learning to stand night brought quiet, and with it, the final passes. I checked that the audio uploaded. I checked that the video certification carried the seal. I checked that the bank schedule showed the paintings as assets and not numbers pulled from air. I taped a small checklist on the wall above my desk studio. Volunteers scheduled packet-assembled timeline set. I set an alarm for the following afternoon when Brooke would speak at the auditorium. I would not interrupt her with noise. I would place the screen and let their words speak themselves into an audience that understood justice without narration. Before sleep, I walked once more to the poster in the window and read it as if someone else had written it. Wanted people who build souls. It was a line my grandfather might have said at his drafting table. He had believed in lines that carried weight without shouting, and I decided to carry mine the same way, one measured step after another, each receipt like a rung on a ladder that would carry me out of a room they thought I would never leave. The week folded into pressure thick enough to taste the emails from Pierce, and Victor landed like lifelines, but the messages from my family came faster, layered with condescension. Thomas wrote that since I insisted on dramatics, he would terminate the lease on my Evanston studio. The building was in his trust name, and he said zoning prohibited educational use anyway. Linda added that the neighbors had filed noise complaints, a lie too smooth from long practice. Brooke messaged that a real business would have permits, not finger paints. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, then kept teaching. The children had painted a mural of sunlight through trees, and their voices filled the space with ordinary faith. But the next morning, the landlord delivered a notice, citing violation of residential zoning, folded neatly in a gold envelope. My hand shook once then steadied. I knew whose lawyer had written it. That night, Linda called parents from the hospital network claiming the studio lacked insurance. 2 canceled sessions immediately. 3 sent anxious emails. My calendar emptied like a draining sink. The silence that followed was heavier than anger. It was designed to break rhythm. Pierce kept me anchored, sending updates. Victor tracing wires, yet each call felt smaller. Against the drum of isolation. One evening the doorbell rang and a courier handed me a letter, threatening civil action for using the Langley name without permission. I laughed because the pettiness was art itself. Still, the exhaustion crept in by Thursday. My account was low, my phone filled with ignored voicemails. From Brooke saying it was not too late to sign and move on, she said peace has a price. I almost believed her. There was a moment before dawn when I sat at my desk, pen poised above the waiver copy, the light gray, the world silent, and thought of how easy surrender would be. How quick the relief might come if I just stopped fighting people who called me idiot in rooms of applause. My thumb brushed the line where my name would go, the ink ready, and then my phone buzzed with a delivery notification pizza on its way to Winnetka. You see, I had ordered it the night before after 1 glass of wine and an impulse 2 large pepperoni pies scheduled for delivery at 7 sharp during the weekly Monroe business dinner. The note attached read from the idiot you raised in joy. I imagined the courier reading it aloud at their polished door, imagined the pause, the forced smiles, the smell of cheese replacing their imported wine, the small chaos of dignity, fighting embarrassment. It made me laugh quietly enough to remember that despair loses power when mocked. I closed the waiver, set the pen aside, opened the window to let the air cool my face, and whispered to no one that idiots do not build evidence. They build exits. At noon, Pierce arrived carrying a small black USB drive and the look of a man who had found something sacred. We sat at the long table in the empty studio, paint stains like constellations on the wood. He connected the drive to my laptop and a video filled the screen. My grandfather in his study. Gray hair combed voice, calm date stamped 2019. He spoke directly to camera, explaining the service clause of his trust, that no asset was to be transferred or pledged by power of attorney, that integrity was the measure of eligibility, not convenience. His tone steady, final a hand gesture at the end as he folded the document and said, "Families are built, not bought." I felt the air leave my chest. Pierce closed the laptop and said, "This is your key." He told me to breathe. The document was authentic, time-stamped. Notarized, it would nullify every attempt they made through the forged POA. I nodded, but could not speak for a moment, because grief and vindication sometimes arrive holding hands outside the window. The street noise returned, children shouting, buses hissing. The city unbothered, I thought of the paintings locked as collateral, the furniture wire, the laughter in that ballroom, and knew that this video would end them. Pierce touched the folder gently and said, "We will file it tomorrow." Then he looked at me and added, "You did not almost sign. You only paused to remember why you fight after he left." I replayed the footage once more alone, my grandfather's eyes clear and patient, the words about service like a hand on my shoulder. Then I backed up the file twice, labeled it truth, and sent a copy to Victor. Later, I cleaned the studio, slowly washing brushes, rearranging canvases, reordering paints, the ritual of control outside the sky, bruised into evening. I watched headlights crawl along the street and thought of my family sitting in silence over their delivered dinner, the smell of melted cheese covering the scent of pretense somewhere between the delivery slip and the first bite. They would have known that silence can carry messages louder than any speech. When I locked the door that night, the air felt different, not lighter, just honest, and I realized that almost giving up can be its own proof of endurance. You reach the edge, look down, then decide to step forward anyway, not into surrender, but into the work of dismantling what hurt you. One legal line, one recorded word, one act of quiet defiance at a time, and I finally slept. By Friday morning, the exhaustion had calcified into clarity. I woke before sunrise and watched the light bleed through the blinds, like a verdict waiting to be read. The waiver still sat on the desk beside my grandfather's video, and I realized the fight had reached its hinge. Everything that came next would be defined by one word: no. I dressed carefully. Not for them, but for the version of myself that had almost given up. And when the call came from Brooke saying there was still time to make peace before tomorrow's recording, I listened to her voice glide through its rehearsed sympathy and said simply, "No." The silence on the other end stretched long enough to become an answer. I hung up and opened my laptop. Pierce had already drafted the petition to the court requesting a temporary restraining order, preventing the recorder's office from finalizing the $18 million deed and freezing all transactions tied to Langley Holdings. He said we would file within the hour and copy the bank. Victor would attach the forensic evidence of the forged POA, the wire transfer, and the misused insurance documents. Our packet had become a fortress of paper, built from their arrogance. I read through the summary line by line until the words felt carved into bone. Then we added the final exhibit, the video of my grandfather articulating the service clause. Pierce said this one will burn through the noise. When we filed at the clerk's office, the stamp sounded like a gavel by noon. The petition was logged and pending, but I did not go home. I walked directly to Northwestern University, where Brooke was scheduled to give her keynote at Thorne Auditorium on the 1st of June, a symposium on ethics in business, hosted by the Alumni Board, the irony so thick it felt designed by fate. I sat in the empty hall for a moment, imagining the lights, the murmurs, the stage where she would smile about legacy. Then I began drafting the plan. 3 parts: 1, legal; 1, public; 1 silent. The legal was already moving through the court. The public would unfold in that auditorium with proof projected instead of applause, and the silent would spread through the institutions that had once respected my family's name. I composed a polite press kit, No accusations, only facts, a timeline, and verified attachments addressed to the Northwestern Board of Ethics, the museum that had borrowed my grandfather's work, and 2 journalists known for covering art fraud, each packet sealed with a short line materials, provided for verification of provenance and compliance review. No adjectives, just precision. After that, I printed a letter on heavy paper to the auction house that had handled our family's sales for years. I wrote respectfully that the Langley originals were now under legal dispute, and any attempt to sell or list them would constitute contempt. The clerk at the front desk blinked when I handed it over, but took it, initialed receipt, and promised to forward it to the compliance director. One corridor of exit sealed one more step toward exposure. By evening, I returned to Evanston, the studio dim and quiet, the children's mural half finished, and for a brief moment, I let the stillness wash over me. Fear had become a background hum rather than a command. Pierce called at 7, saying the judge wanted additional documents. I forwarded everything within minutes, and an hour later, he called again, his tone lighter. The court had granted a temporary restraining order. Effective immediately, the deed transfer frozen until further hearing. Langley Holdings transactions locked the penthouse recording scheduled for tomorrow could not proceed. I felt the words settle into me like oxygen after a long dive. It was not victory yet, but it was structure. The foundation under my feet, I thanked him, hung up and stood by the window watching the streetlights blink on one by one, thinking of how fragile arrogance looks when confronted by paperwork it cannot manipulate. I poured tea, opened my notebook, and outlined the presentation for the auditorium, not to speak, but to let evidence speak. Each exhibit labeled each document. Timed video, first, then the bank schedule, then the wire logs ending with the insurance change, and the voice recording from the peninsula. Victor would handle the technical setup. Pierce would attend quietly in the back. The truth would not need my commentary. It would play itself at midnight. I printed the cover page that read, "Public Record of Facts Prepared for Verification," and placed it atop the folder before sleeping. I sent one final email to the auction house confirming receipt, and another to Brooke, a single sentence, "See you at Thorne." I did not sign my name the next morning. The sun rose behind clouds, but the light was enough. I stood in the doorway of the studio, looked once more at the sign, "Wanted People Who Build Souls," and understood that building also meant demolition, that sometimes you must take apart what pretends to be family to make room for something honest. The court order notification arrived on my phone. Just then, TRO granted, effective immediately, recorder instructed to hold deed confirmation attached. I smiled and whispered no, again this time, not as defiance, but as affirmation, the cleanest word in the world when spoken to those who never imagined you could refuse. Thorne Auditorium filled with the kind of anticipation that feels rehearsed, the smell of perfume and paper programs mingling beneath the spotlights as rows of alumni settled in their laughter, soft and expectant. The event banner above the stage read Ethics and Legacy, and Brooke stood behind the podium dressed in ivory, her hair sculpted like an advertisement for control. I sat near the center aisle, halfway back where the light faded my folder resting on my lap. Victor, a few seats behind, managing the laptop connection. Pierce at the far corner with his phone ready, the stage lights dim to signal beginning. Brooke's voice flowed through the microphone. Steady and trained, she spoke of leadership, transparency, responsibility words she had never met in practice. The audience nodded, eager to be inspired. Then she paused for effect and smiled, her voice rising into a cadence that was almost religious. She said justice is not inherited. It is earned through merit and the wisdom to act when others hesitate. The phrase hung in the air like bait, and that was the cue. Victor pressed the remote, the house lights dropped to a low hum, and the massive projector screen behind her flickered from the university logo to a simple black background. Then a single image appeared. My phone lock screen frozen at the moment that had changed everything. the text clear for the entire room to read. One missed call. Judge Alan Pierce below it. The voicemail transcription deed transfer not recorded yet forged. POA call me now murmurs rippled. Brooke turned confused, at first then angry. Her microphone crackled as she asked what was happening. The next slide began automatically. The video file labeled Langley Archive 2019 opened. My grandfather appeared on the screen. Gray suit, reading glasses sliding down his nose. His voice calm and deliberate. He spoke of the service clause, of the prohibition against using a power of attorney to transfer or pledge assets, of the moral duty attached to the Langley name. And his last line was clear. Even in the large room, no one may claim what they have not served. The image faded, and the silence was total. I could hear my own breath. Pierce rose slightly but said nothing. Victor cued the next exhibit. A digital scan of the power of attorney signature filled the screen beside a forensic comparison chart. The analyst's caption highlighted differences in pen pressure, ink age, and baseline variation. The conclusion printed at the bottom, signature non-authentic. Brooke's voice trembled into the microphone. This is fake. Her laugh came out brittle somewhere. A camera phone clicked, then another. Soon a sea of tiny screens lifted like stars recording, watching, waiting. Victor switched slides again. A cropped image of the wire log appeared. Langley Holdings, outgoing transfer $380,000 USD to Linda Monroe. Personal account memo, Interior Imports, Milan. Then the collateral agreement followed the painting titles, appraised values, and the signature line identical to Thomas's. Someone in the front row whispered loud enough for others to hear, "That is self-dealing," and the whisper spread like wind. Finally, the last document filled the wall. The insurance change request policy number ending 3754. Beneficiary changed from Tessa Monroe to Brooke Monroe, dated February 2019. Thomas's handwriting, visible on the witness line. The audience shifted uncomfortably. And then the voicemail audio played, Judge Pierce's voice stating, "Deed transfer not recorded forged POA, call me now." It echoed through the hall. Clear, official, irrefutable. Brooke turned back toward the screen, her face pale beneath the stage lights, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Linda stood at the side aisle trying to reach her, but froze when she saw the Northern Trust representative rising from his seat. He walked to the microphone and introduced himself quietly. His tone measured, as of this afternoon, the institution has confirmed receipt of a temporary restraining order issued by Cook County. All assets related to Langley Holdings and the associated deed are suspended pending judicial review. His words dropped like stones in water. Every head turned toward Brooke, her lips trembling. She muttered, "This is private family business." Someone in the front row said not anymore, and laughter, thin and nervous, rippled through the room. The representative continued, "We have verified the chain of custody for the vault materials and the validity of the recordings presented. These records match our internal logs. The seal at the bottom, right corner, glowed in the light. Authenticity confirmed." Brooke's microphone fell to the floor with a thud. Feedback screeched. I watched her step back, her composure cracking. Thomas rushed forward from the aisle, shouting that this was manipulation, that he would sue, but his voice wavered when another man stood near the edge of the stage, tall, composed, wearing the judicial pin of Cook County Circuit Court. He raised his hand for quiet and said the court advises all parties to maintain silence. The TRO is active, and any attempt to interfere with frozen assets will constitute contempt. The crowd exhaled collectively, a murmur that sounded like judgment itself. I felt the blood return to my fingers. Linda sank into a chair near the front. Brooke covered her face with both hands. Phones continued to film their flashes, reflecting off tears she could not hide. I stood slowly, the movement drawing a few eyes. I did not speak. I simply walked toward the exit. Each step measured the murmurs parting around me. Outside, the night air hit cool and full of sound sirens, somewhere distant. The lake breeze sharp with June salt. Victor joined me moments later, carrying the laptop. He said quietly, "It worked." I nodded. Pierce emerged last, his expression unreadable, but his voice soft. Public exposure is never elegant, but truth rarely is. I looked back through the glass doors where the crowd still clustered under the dim light. Brooke kneeling beside her mother. Thomas arguing with a man holding a camera. The word justice scrolling across the projector. One final time, before the system timed out, I turned away and walked toward Michigan Avenue, the city alive around me. My phone buzzing with messages. I did not open the Air Electric. My heartbeat steady, the image of that auditorium etched in my mind, not as revenge, but as record proof that quiet voices can break the loudest rooms when armed with evidence and patience. Somewhere behind me, a woman said into her phone, "I have never seen anything like it." And I smiled faintly because neither had I. Yet I had imagined it every night since that ballroom humiliation, and now it was real. The morning after Thorne Auditorium felt strangely quiet, the city already moving on. While the echoes of last night's exposure still rang in the family's ears, Pierce called at 8 to confirm that Cook County had issued companion orders to freeze all Langley Holdings subsidiary accounts. Pending audit, Victor forwarded screenshots from Northern Trust, showing every related fund flagged for investigation. The line items read account, suspended under judicial review, and somewhere in Winnetka Thomas was learning what that meant in real time. By noon, the luxury car dealer called to report that his Rolls-Royce had been repossessed, pending clarification of the collateral attached to the $1.2 million loan secured by the stolen paintings. He tried to blame an administrative error, but the finance department had already received notice from the court. The car was held at a secured facility, not for his use for evidence. Linda's phone went to voicemail after 3 rings. Later, Victor sent a note that her credit card was declined at a boutique in Gold Coast, small symbols of a collapse measured in missed payments and revoked privileges. Brooke's fall came faster. The university's press office released a statement that her mentorship role was suspended indefinitely pending review of ethical conduct. Within hours, the photo of her standing beneath the word "Ethics at Thorne" had become a meme on alumni threads. Gavin, her fiancé, released a carefully worded post on LinkedIn about unforeseen circumstances and professional integrity, then quietly removed their engagement photos from social media. Someone forwarded me his message with the comment, "Classy way to run." I did not reply. I simply sat in the studio and let the sunlight fill the paint jars, each one catching the dust that swirled in silence. I opened my laptop to dozens of new emails, not from journalists, but from parents, some whom Linda had once belittled, thanking me for standing up. One message read, "My daughter talks about your classes every day. She says it's the only place she feels safe." I felt my throat tighten. The revenge that mattered was never about money. It was about voice. And now it echoed where the noise of their arrogance used to live still. I wanted something quieter, something small and deliberate, so I printed a stack of gift vouchers for free art therapy sessions embossed with the studio logo and addressed each envelope to a parent Linda had once mocked for not affording private tutors. Inside, I added a note written in fountain ink, "Because your child deserves color, regardless of the adults around them." I mailed them that afternoon, the post office clerk smiling as I slid the envelopes across the counter. It felt like balancing an invisible scale, returning grace where contempt had sat. Victor texted later that the museum, which had borrowed my grandfather's work, sent an official notice to Thomas, demanding immediate return of all Langley paintings, citing violation of loan agreements and unauthorized collateralization. Failure to comply within 10 days could trigger a breach penalty of $300,000 and permanent blacklisting from institutional partnerships. The email included the phrase "material breach" in bold. Pierce called again, saying Thomas had already tried to argue that the pieces were family-owned, but the provenance traced back to the trust itself, untouchable under the service clause. He was cornered. I thanked Pierce and asked if I needed to do anything. He laughed softly and said no. Sometimes the best move is to sit still and let gravity work. The newspapers by afternoon carried short blurbs. No names yet, but enough hints for anyone familiar with the Monroes to read between the lines. One article described a developing case involving alleged misuse of family assets and a contested estate connected to a prominent Chicago lineage. Linda's friends stopped calling. Her social media vanished overnight. A few allies tried to post defenses, but deleted them after comments flooded with the video clip of the auditorium, the one where my grandfather's words echoed across the dark. Meanwhile, in Evanston, the studio grew busier. Parents arriving with soft smiles, children asking questions I could finally answer without fear of losing space or funding. Art therapy always begins with honesty, and mine had been painted in public. I ordered more supplies restocked, the clay opened the windows, the laughter of children louder than any courtroom victory at night. I sat by the window with tea watching the streetlights and thought about justice, how it rarely arrives. Dramatic. How it seeps in through the cracks left by arrogance. I received an email from Northern Trust confirming compliance with the court's order, a second from Pierce attaching the museum's formal request to the court to inventory the paintings, and a third from Victor subject line receipts inside a single line. They are the ones drowning now, not you. I smiled faintly, not in triumph, but in release. The noise that once defined my family's gatherings had turned to silence, the kind that precedes reckoning. I closed my laptop, folded the voucher's copy into my journal, and wrote 2 words beside it, still standing, because that was the truest revenge, the steady continuation of life built on what they tried to erase outside the city, hummed unbothered inside. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice again saying, "Families are built," not bought the phrase landing softly, like a benediction, as the night stretched long and peaceful proof that the fallout had not destroyed me, it had only cleared the air for something honest to grow. Linda arrived without announcement the following Wednesday, her reflection visible through the frosted glass. Before the door even opened, she looked smaller. Somehow, makeup streaked a silk scarf pulled tight around a trembling throat. Her voice cracked before the first word formed. There's been a margin call, the papers printed it. "Tessa, please, we need to keep this in the family." I stood still behind the studio counter, the faint smell of turpentine and clay, grounding me in the present while her desperation belonged to the past. She spoke fast about investors pulling out, about friends, not answering her calls, about how Brooke was breaking under pressure. I listened silent. Then she tried the word family again, as if repetition could undo years of cruelty. I asked her if she remembered the day she called my work childish. She nodded through tears. I told her that night I decided to never mistake silence for weakness. She wiped her face and begged me to sign a confidentiality agreement. Brooke's attorney had drafted said we could resolve everything quietly, that forgiveness looked better in headlines. I asked to see the document. She pulled it from her purse, trembling, the non-disclosure clause thick as a rope. I read it carefully, then slid it back. "No," I said softly. "Not until every theft is named aloud." Linda pressed her palms together, whispering that reporters were calling and that Thomas was being audited. She asked what I wanted. I answered without hesitation. Truth, restitution, and accountability within an hour. An email arrived from Brooke, herself polite, overly composed. She wrote that she was willing to negotiate a peaceful family settlement if I agreed to keep the matter private. Her phrasing so clinical it might as well have been written by counsel. I replied with my own list, concise and surgical. A public apology delivered at the Peninsula Hotel, in the same room where I had been humiliated, full restitution of all Langley artworks, including penalties for illegal use as collateral repayment of funds withdrawn from Langley Holdings, with accumulated interest, Brooke, to complete 2 years of community service at Monroe Art and Healing at base pay $100 per session, logged and reported mandatory family therapy. 52 weeks under court oversight, and a binding non-disparagement clause that protects not reputation but integrity. I closed the message with a single line: dignity over convenience. Their choice, not mine. Victor laughed when I told him, said the list read like an onboarding manual for remorse that gave me an idea. So the next morning I printed a small booklet titled Doing Good 101 and mailed it to their house. Inside, I included simple illustrations of hands wearing cleaning gloves, a list of studio chores from sweeping paint dust to sterilizing brushes, and a line at the end that read, "Every redemption begins with service." I imagined Linda's face opening it, confusion curdling into shame, the quiet kind that lingers days past, silence stretched until Victor called. Late Friday, his tone sharp. Thomas had tried to outsmart the freeze by contacting a private auction broker in Miami, offering one of the Langley originals under a fabricated provenance. Victor's firm intercepted the correspondence when the broker requested authenticity verification. They found the email in a security camera snapshot from the parking lot of the storage facility, showing Thomas loading a wrapped canvas into his car, the image time stamped and forwarded directly to Pierce. Within hours, the court issued an emergency hold and a contempt citation warning. Pierce said this was the final nail. I exhaled slowly. The old ache of disbelief replaced by something colder, not triumph, but inevitability. The kind of stillness that follows exposure. That night, I sat alone in the studio, surrounded by children's drawings and the hum of the city. Outside, the phone buzzed with one more message from Linda. Just 5 words: "Please don't destroy us." I looked at the screen for a long time before replying, "I am not destroying you, I am recording the truth." Then I turned the phone face down and returned to work, the clay beneath my hands cool and pliable. The world finally balanced enough to shape something new. August arrived heavy with heat and headlines. The courthouse steps glimmered in the noon sun as reporters gathered outside, holding notepads and microphones. But inside the probate chamber, the air was cool and exact, the smell of polished wood and paper, the only scent of justice that mattered. Judge Hollis presided with the kind of calm that makes liars tremble on one side. Thomas sat flanked by counsel, Linda behind him, gripping her pearls. Brooke beside Gavin, pretending composure on the other. I sat with Pierce and Victor, quiet but steady, the folder before me, labeled Langley, Holdings and its weight. The judge reviewed the exhibits one by one. The forged power of attorney, the deed drafts, the forensic ink analysis, the vault footage, the insurance change forms, each introduced into the record until the pile of deceit grew taller than any of their excuses. Then the ruling came clear, as the gavel that followed the power of attorney is hereby declared invalid. Any transaction executed under it, null and void. The transfer of Langley Holdings shares rescinded full ownership, restored to the original trust under trustee Tessa Monroe. Thomas's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. The courtroom murmured as the judge continued all Langley artworks to be returned within 30 days. Under court supervision, a civil penalty applied for unauthorized use as collateral, and for associated legal costs, the $2 million life insurance policy reinstated with beneficiaries, as recorded in the verified 2019 video declaration co-beneficiary status shared between Tessa Monroe and the Langley Service Foundation. Brooke Monroe to be considered secondary contingent beneficiary following completion of 2 consecutive years of community service, verified by independent review. The judge paused, then looked directly at Brooke. His voice, "Even should this service not be completed, all benefits will revert entirely to the foundation. No appeal shall alter this condition." Brooke lowered her eyes. Color draining, the next decree addressed Thomas for violation of fiduciary duties and false representation of corporate records. You are fined under civil penalty and placed under financial supervision. Any transaction exceeding $10,000 requires written consent from the trustee until review completion. The gallery exhaled a collective sound of disbelief. Linda wiped her eyes, though no tears came. Gavin kept staring at the table as if the wood might offer escape. The judge leaned forward. These acts are not mere accounting errors. They are betrayals within family, and the court treats them with gravity equal to theft. He then turned toward me. Ms. Monroe, regarding your claim of coercion and public humiliation, the court acknowledges that the harm caused extends beyond financial loss. Therefore, we award nominal damages and attorney's fees payable from the Monroe estate, the sum itself modest but symbolic. I nodded once the number did not matter, only the acknowledgement Pierce whispered that the order included a note allowing restitution funds to be directed to charity, if I wished later when the judge asked for comment. I rose slowly, my voice steady. I will use the awarded amount to establish a scholarship for students in art therapy and restorative justice under my grandfather's name. His legacy was service, not spectacle. The court reporter typed each word the moment passing, like the closing of a circle outside. Flashes burst as we stepped through the marble doors. Pierce smiled faintly, saying justice often sounds like arithmetic when spoken aloud, but it feels like poetry when lived. Victor laughed. Quietly, said he already had 2 reporters asking for comment, and he told them the truth that this was not revenge but math corrected. I looked across the plaza at the skyline rising beyond the lake, thought of the family dinners that once smelled of expensive wine and false laughter. How they would now echo with absence the paintings would return. The trust would fund real healing, and the Monroe name would stand again, not through deceit, but restitution. A reporter shouted a question about forgiveness. I answered without turning. Forgiveness is earned through change, not requests. The wind off Lake Michigan carried the words away behind me. Brooke called softly. Tessa, please. I stopped but did not look back. My answer, brief 2 years of service, then we will talk. She said she understood, but her voice shook. I walked on the courthouse steps gleaming under the August sun, the same sun that once lit the ballroom where they called me idiot, and now it lit the papers bearing my name beside the word trustee, the arithmetic of dignity complete at last. December came soft and pale, the snow in Evanston falling in long, quiet streaks that caught the morning light outside the windows of the new Monroe. Art and Healing Foundation. The sign still smelled of fresh paint. The doors opened at 8, and the first families walked in wrapped in scarves, and Shy hoped the hum of children's voices rose gently between the rooms, and I could feel the rhythm of purpose in every brushstroke and laugh. The foundation had partnered with Lurie Children's Hospital. We ran art therapy sessions for kids facing trauma and chronic illness. Each instructor paid a fair $60,000 a year. Minimum, no unpaid passion, no quiet exploitation, masked as calling. I watched the team hang new canvases, each one a different color of resilience. The walls lined with framed notes from parents. You helped my son speak. You gave my daughter peace. Small miracles written in crayon in gratitude. I worked behind the reception desk that morning. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to feel the heartbeat of what we built across the hall. Brooke stood in a paint-stained apron, hair tied back shoulders, hunched not from shame but effort. She had completed her first 3 months of service under the court's order, cleaning brushes, mopping floors, shadowing therapists, learning how color could rebuild what pride once destroyed. At first, she avoided my eyes. Now she sometimes met them, tentative but real. She had started a journal. Pierce told me about its first page titled, From Revenge to Repair. I had not read it. I did not need to. Some lessons only take root in silence. Linda and Thomas showed up on weekends now, volunteering quietly at the children's exhibit, where they tore ticket stubs and handed out programs they never asked for forgiveness. They earned their space by repetition and humility. They paid the fines in full before the deadline, every receipt filed, every apology unspoken, but lived through service. Pierce visited occasionally, always with that knowing smile, Victor, 2 dropping off boxes of supplies labeled donations from anonymous patrons. Though I knew who the patrons were, those who once called me idiot, now funding color therapy in secret. as if redemption required secrecy. The irony gentle and strangely human on Christmas Eve. I stayed late after everyone left the hallways dim and peaceful, the snow outside reflecting the streetlights in soft gold. I carried one of my grandfather's restored paintings to the front room, the one reclaimed from the vault, and returned under court order. It was smaller than I remembered a landscape of Lake Michigan at dawn, muted blues and faint lilac sky in the bottom corner, his handwriting barely visible beneath the varnish. Wealth is a tool. Dignity is the work. I ran my fingers along the frame and felt something unclench in my chest. The kind of release that is not loud but final. I thought of the first night at the Drake when they called me an idiot in front of everyone, how that humiliation had burned like acid then, and how now it had become fuel for something that healed instead of harmed. I did not forgive them in one grand act. I forgave them piece by piece every time a child smiled or a parent exhaled relief, every time Brooke swept the floor without complaint, every time Linda quietly refilled the hot chocolate urn. Forgiveness became less of a gesture and more of a rhythm. The snow outside thickened, the street empty, but for the soft crunch of tires far away, I locked the doors and stepped onto the sidewalk. The lake wind cold and honest. I walked down to the shoreline where the ice met water, the city lights reflecting across the surface, like constellations of second chances. I set the small portable frame of my grandfather's quote on a bench and whispered, "Thank you," not to him alone, but to the version of myself that chose to stand instead of surrender, that chose truth over comfort. And in that stillness, I understood that justice was never the noise of victory, but the calm after a storm, the quiet proof that survival can be graceful, that repair can be deliberate. I took a photo of the lake to mark the moment, not for social media, but for memory, a reminder that dignity once reclaimed does not fade, it grows. I walked back slowly through the snow, the studio lights glowing warm against the dark. Behind the glass, the children's drawings still pinned to the wall shimmered faintly like beacons, each line a testimony that beauty survives even the cruelest arithmetic. And as I turned off the lights, I whispered to the empty room, a promise if anyone watching has ever faced betrayal from those who should have protected you. Remember that your quiet justice matters. Your silent revenge is not destruction, but reconstruction. Stand up for yourself with grace and truth, because dignity over money is not just a phrase. It is the foundation of peace and revenge. Through truth will always bring the closure. They said you would never find the wind caught my breath and carried it out across the lake, and I smiled, knowing the story was not ending. It was beginning again in the hands of every person brave enough to choose truth.